Hello and welcome to the latest Retire Well episode filmed by Wealth of Advice. So today we're going to cover the state pension and lots of common questions that we get about it.
Yeah, so before we got started today, Matthew between sections has been giving me a bit of grief about all the different facts that I've been doing. So I thought we'd test Matthew with a little bit of pension trivia this morning with regards to state pensions. So Matthew, do you
haven't had a coffee this morning.
We'll see how it goes. Do you have any idea of the origins of pensions and maybe even pensions in the UK?
I think someone once said something about Australia, so we're going to say something like Australia.
I mean, not very close at all. I do have to refer to my notes. So pensions generally date back all the way to 6 AD, with Augustus bringing them in the Roman Empire, called Aerarium Militare, which was essentially just a pension for Roman legions that have had 20 plus years service. Then pushed forward to sort of the 16th century with disabled Navy seamen, and then obviously the old age pension, which was the first pension in the UK, came in 1909. Do you have any idea of the requirements for receiving that old age pension in 1909, Matthew?
1909, I wasn't around, so no, I've not got a clue.
No, so it was paid from age 70, and bearing in mind life expectancy at the time was 51, didn't have a really good value, and then it was 5 shillings a week, but to receive that you needed to be of good character, and it could be reduced if you had excess furniture in your house.
Oh dear.
So a couple of bits of trivia from myself.
So what does that equate to in modern terms? How much is 5 shillings get you now?
That's something I'll have to put on my revision list for the next episode. But moving on to what we'll be talking about today, we'll be exploring, as Matthew said, where that's sort of come to now, what we have with regards to a state pension, how can you claim it, and all the different intricacies of it. Matthew, I think probably a good place to start is in 2016. It's not going to be a full history podcast, I promise, but there was a couple of changes that sort of came around in 2016 that changed quite a lot for people with the state pension.
Yeah, I think it was mainly to try and simplify things, and lots of people sort of are frustrated with pensions in general because they say, okay, we've simplified things, but actually that makes it more complicated by having sort of separate sort of categories and classes of things. The simplest thing to think about of the new state pension is that a full state pension would get you £221.20 a week, so that relates to £11,500 per annum, and that essentially in order to qualify for this you have to have 35 years worth of national insurance sort of savings. People get sort of upset about the state pension quite a lot, and it's quite a sort of we commonly get, well, people say, can I rely on it? Should I rely on it? Is it going to be in existence when I get to retirement? And then people often get quite upset about the triple lock and the inflation bits. So yeah, certainly lots of people when we're talking about pensions are passionate about the state pension for various different reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned the triple lock there. Although it's quite a politicised thing at the moment, and people feel like it's been around forever with regards to sort of the inflation increase and the other two elements of the triple lock, actually only came around in 2011 in the Conservative Lib Dem coalition. And essentially what it did, it tried to make sure that the state pension, you were never going to be worse off than inflation. So the three elements are it will increase in line with either CPI, which is essentially a basket of goods. It's inflation, which obviously has been quite a lot over the last few years. It would be earnings of the general public in the UK, so the state pension will keep pace with wage rises, and then the sort of stop loss essentially is 2.5%. So if either of the first two are less than 2.5%, the 2.5% will be the increase for the following year, which I think is probably the most, well, not controversial, but the thing that most people discuss about, well, will triple lock change or not?
Yeah, I think the thing with the state pension is it's clearly a very expensive sort of pension for the government to provide, and therefore, certainly younger generation, people our age would say, if we're planning the future, should we rely on the state pension / will it be there? I think the obvious answer to that sort of politically is to say, Margaret Thatcher's still known as the milk snatcher. Can anyone actually get rid of the state pension or get rid of the triple lock from the state pension without impacting themselves and their reputation? And do you want to be known as, the person who got rid of the state pension or the person who affected pensioners by removing the inflation lock? I mean, I saw something the other day which said Keir Starmer farmer harmer, again with a small change to inheritance tax and specifically looking at those changes with the farmers. So can anyone ever really put their head above the parapet and say the state pension triple lock is too expensive, let's change it? And my personal opinion would be that's political suicide, so someone would have to be really not wanting to get themselves elected if they were to make that decision.
Yeah, I think you're going to have a really strong government to go ahead and remove the triple lock. And to be honest, in my opinion, they'd probably have to run on a mandate for it in an election, because if Labour were to sort of go ahead and say, let's remove the triple lock, I mean, if I was an MP that was for Labour that were removing it, I personally wouldn't be voting against it because I'm not going to have a job in the next 4 or 5 years. So from a selfish point of view of an MP, I can't really see them doing it either.
True. And in terms of the actual, the bigger picture of how expensive it is to provide and should it be provided, almost then doesn't come into it because, well, it's a no-brainer that we can't politically get rid of it or change it. Having something that increases in line with the triple lock is very generous, and certainly over recent years of inflation, which has been higher than the normal, that has been overly generous. And because it survived through that period, you would think, the triple lock would survive for the long term based on surviving what was a stupidly high inflation.
Yeah, exactly. And we probably wouldn't be having the same conversation 5 years ago when inflation was consistently under sort of that 2% target. So they weren't really as large rises, as they have been.
Yeah, and the state pension age has obviously gone up over time. Obviously, when it was first introduced, that was a bit different. But looking at the modern state pension, it's currently 67 for people who are reaching that age now. It's going up to 67 by 2028, and then to go slowly up in line with that life expectancy. And the general gist of the state pension is to say it goes up in line with life expectancy, and then that minimum pension age where someone can access a private pension is then also going up in line with that segment. So that was 55 going up to 57, and that's because the state pension's gone up to 67. So the likelihood would be, as modern medicine improves and we continue to live longer, the state pension would also be tapering up in line with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Just jumping that, I think you might have said it's currently 67, but I know that was a misspeak. Currently 66, going up to 67 in 2028. And for anyone that's under the age of 46, it'll be 68 when you get there. Yeah. Maybe more for me, who knows?
True. So, when we talk to people about pensions and planning for retirement, we rightly say, have you or do you expect to get a full state pension, so you can then factor that into your planning in terms of the minimum number of years and the maximum number of years. Essentially, people should keep a close eye to that. That takes us on nicely to sort of fill in any gaps, and that's certainly a topic we've had recently with the likes of Martin Lewis championing the idea of checking your state pension forecast, checking your national insurance, and looking to fill any gaps. Do you want to have a little chat about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think what Martin Lewis, he had a prime time slot, didn't he, a couple of weeks ago.
He gets a bit more attention than we do.
Yeah, and was talking about it quite a lot. But I think it's a good thing because a lot of people don't understand that there is a time limit on backfilling and whether you can actually backfill at all. So the current sort of deadline for backfilling any years, and when we say backfill, as Matthew said, you need 10 years minimum for the new state pension, and then you need 35 years to get a full maximum state pension of 11,500. If you're anywhere between that 10 and 35 years, you can essentially make voluntary contributions to your national insurance to top up the amount that you'll have in retirement. It depends on how much of the year you've contributed and when that year was to how much it will cost to upgrade. It used to be around sort of 800, mid 800s. Now recently it could be up to sort of £910 a year to top up each national insurance year. But when you do that, you essentially get an additional £12.50 or roughly a week per year, onto your state pension. So that's £12.50 per year that added on. Doesn't sound that much for sort of a £800, £900 cost outright, but when you do look at it, I find that majority of cases, and Matthew, would you agree, it makes sense to do?
Yeah, we've talked it through with clients. Typically, the average payback is 3 years of having the state pension in payment. So the average person whose normal life expectancy is likely to be, say, 87, if you're starting the state pension at 67, you are going to be better off by topping up your national insurance and getting that guaranteed income. The decision to top up it and have those voluntary contributions is a bit like an annuity, which is providing a guaranteed income. You're transferring some money across to the government in exchange for a slightly higher guaranteed income with that triple lock, and as long as you survive for over 3 years of the state pension being paid, you are better off for that decision. The only time when it probably isn't better off, you wouldn't be better off for doing it, tends to be that last year potentially. And we've had some people who, instead of that extra £12.83 per week that you talked about, some people for the last year it could be a couple of pounds extra a week, and that changes the break-even point from 3 years to a lot longer. But in general, it's a no-brainer, and it's not often in our industry that we can say the phrase no-brainer. It's a no-brainer for people to top up and to make sure they've got that full entitlement, because ultimately it's a guaranteed income source from a reputable provider in the government, and you know that with inflation, your sort of purchasing power, your spending power is being matched and being preserved. So it makes complete sense. We have had a few people who have asked us about it, and we've talked through their options. There is a few sort of extra bits. So we've had some people who look after, grandparents who look after grandchildren can qualify for what's called an adult childcare credit. And again, by where parents of those children are working and they're building up their own NI naturally, those grandparents can claim for that adult childcare credit, and by doing that they get essentially a 3 years worth of national insurance. So those people who are already looking after the grandchildren can qualify, and it's a cheap way of doing it, and saves themselves between £850 or £900 per year by ticking those off. There's a few other things like jury service that can count as well. Obviously you're not in control of that in the same way, but it's just almost thinking, between now and the state pension, will I get to the full 35 years? And if I don't expect to, then it makes complete sense to look at those gaps. Joe and I were chatting the other day, and we're far enough away from state pension age that it's, we're likely to build up enough years and we don't need to go and top up our years. But when I looked at mine, for example, there was 1 year when I was at university and working at Tesco's, and I must have had, in the holidays, I must have had enough hours and enough income to have some national insurance paid, but not enough for the full credit. So I could go and make a voluntary contribution of £150 to build up an extra full year for me. I don't think that probably makes sense, because I am going to get there naturally through working. But if my circumstances were different and I was older and closer to that age and I wasn't quite at the full amount, it would be again a no-brainer for me to say £150 is less than the £900, so I'll go and look in the rearview mirror at that oldest year available.
Yeah, absolutely. completely agree with Matthew. I've had similar conversations with younger clients where they say, well, we know this deadline is coming, should I top up? The majority of the time we would usually look closer to retirement, because it's the expectation that you will have that sort of 35 years working life. To put in context something where it might work well, I was actually speaking to a client just last week. She had around 10, just over 10 years, which means she was entitled to around £67 a week in state pension.
Yeah.
She did have 18 potential years that she could top up, which would bring her state pension to, I think it was around £185 a week, which is £6,000 extra a year, and for the cost of £15,000, which it was to top up those years. Like Matthew says, she's going to get it back in 3 years once she gets to state pension age, and she was telling me about how her mum lived late into her 90s, so she could potentially get even more back from the government.
Yeah, and I think people who've ever worked overseas and therefore haven't built up national insurance during those years in the UK, but now they're living in the UK, retiring in the UK, they're certainly people who it's worth looking at, because as you described, you might build up 10 plus years, but there's still a good chunk of years to fill. And that's the idea that, yes, on paper, multiple years of that £800, £900 feels expensive. But when you think about the benefit that you've just described, again, it makes complete sense. And if it was a private option, someone would be saying, where do I sign? How do I get that pension? So the fact that it's also provided by the government with that financial strength 100% makes sense.
Yeah, so I think we've talked quite a lot about topping up and who should do it, but there's obviously a couple of cases where people might not be in the best interest to top up. Obviously, we've mentioned people that might be away from retirement might not actually reach retirement age, because the state pension, there's no death benefits, at least for the new state pension, that there may have been in previous iterations of it. But if you pass away, then it can't go to your spouse. The other thing that I just wanted to touch on is just have a think about pension credit. So pension credit can top up your income past state pension age to, it's around £218 a week if you don't have earnings up to that amount. But if you do have sort of any significant savings over £10,000, that can reduce your eligibility. And then equally, if you've got pensions that are maybe able to be drawn down on, but not, they essentially count that as income. So just a couple of things to know. It's not necessarily a
I think
yes or no.
that's a valid point. I think health is probably the main reason why someone wouldn't choose to top up. Again, uncertainty over health, or someone with a potentially reduced life expectancy might say, why do I bother to transfer and have the extra contributions? And I think the other side of it is going back to the mechanics of the state pension. It is a taxable income source. So someone who had a very large private pension might say, I know I could top up my national insurance, and I know I could have more state pension as a guaranteed income source there of taxable income, but do I need to? And so I might say, well, if I have got something like ill health, maybe I've got enough of a private pension and enough income sources that I don't need to do it. So that's probably the only occasions where people would say, I don't need to. One almost myth as well, some people get upset and say, I've worked in the UK for 40 years, how have I not built up 35 years? So sometimes people look and they say, I'm missing 4 or 5 years, but since I was 16, I have been working, so where have my contributions gone? Again, we've talked about pensions not being simple and how the rules change. When people have been contracted out, there's been a time when they haven't had the full national insurance build up in the state pension because it's built up in a separate private pension. And a bit like the hokey cokey, the government have changed that when people were in and then they were out. So over the years, people have almost lost track of saying, okay, I think I was contracted out, I don't know. But people who are in that situation, they have benefited because they have built up funds in a private pension elsewhere, often a defined benefit pension, so often with a guaranteed income source. And that same individual can then still get that national insurance back up to the full amount and can benefit from the full state pension. So if you are in that situation, don't worry, you haven't financially lost out about any changes like contracting out. You've actually done better. It's just that it's a bit greyer because you don't know 100% where it's gone over the years. Yeah,
and equal to that, we mentioned sort of in 2016 the new state pension was brought in trying to simplify things. If you reach state pension prior to that age and listen to the podcast, you may see stuff like SP2, additional state pension, SERPs.
Yeah.
Do you want to run through just quickly, not in too much detail, of what they are, Matthew?
I think in the simplest sense, they are additional state pensions, so above the basic state pension, and they were built up in different years with different accrual rates. essentially, if you have reached the state pension before that, you have a little bit more. And you mentioned things like death benefits. Traditionally the new state pension, isn't passed on to a spouse, but some of the old state pension could have been. So, to keep it as simple as possible on here, I think you should ignore death benefits from a state pension, but certainly the older state pensions did have a few extra quirks about them. And again, what else changed when we had the new state pension? Previously, there was a bit more flexibility in relation to deferring a state pension, and people could take that deferment as a lump sum. So we had quite a few clients who were working past state pension age said, with the old state pension, I'm going to choose not to take it, and therefore when I'm ready, I'll take it, I'll have that as a lump sum. Brilliant. With the new state pension, the modern state pension, you can defer it, and whenever anyone says to us, should I? The answer to that feels like no, because if you were to defer it for every 9 weeks, you can get an extra 1% added, but actually, you're missing out on that payment, and that increase isn't beneficial compared to the extra year of having it and the triple lock kicking in, especially in a high inflation environment. So, yes, it's an income source. So someone who's already got taxable income sources, it is going to sit on top, and you have got an extra slice of taxable income. But it makes sense to have it and to adjust your planning accordingly. So make pension contributions to reduce your taxable income, or do something else rather than simply deferring it.
Yeah, I completely agree on that one. I think that's one where it probably is going to become more and more common, that question, as retirement isn't necessarily now you finish at state pension age and retire completely. We have a few clients of our own where they're in sort of part-time work, might have returned to work at a different point. But as Matthew said, it's very much, for every year you don't take the pension, that's potentially sort of £11,500 that you could lose out if you were to pass away.
Yeah, I think, again, if we think about common questions that we tend to get on the state pension, the obvious one is the tax situation. So the state pension's always paid gross. So it's a taxable income source where no tax is taken directly, and your other income sources are adjusted to account for the tax. Again, if you have a private pension and a state pension, your private pension is essentially an employer in retirement, and they just sort out the tax for you, and it goes through the normal PAYE system. So people are reassured when we tell them about that. And the other thing that people can get quite sort of passionate about and upset about recently is the idea of, could the state pension change as we've described? And one of the things that people ask is, could it be means tested in the future? Again, politically, we don't have a crystal ball to answer that one.
I think that it's very similar to sort of the triple lock in the fact that it would be a really politicised argument, and by taking away the state pension, you take away the sort of stability of planning that people have paid into it for 35 years, and then you're going to take it away. I think, to be honest, means testing the state pension would be more of a kick in the teeth for people than taking away the triple lock. Well, I suppose dependent on sort of where you sit.
Yeah, I think ultimately, if we go back to why does the state pension exist, and also why do people encourage to save into private pensions, it's for them to take control of their own retirement, to control their income and expenditure, and for them to enjoy retirement that they've provided for themselves. So the government want to give people the basic state pension as a boost, and we have lots of clients who, as they spend less as they get older, a state pension provides a backbone through retirement spending, and it becomes a fantastic, extra income source to meet people's needs and tick off a lot of the objectives. Like we described earlier, it would be political suicide for someone to rip up or change the state pension too dramatically, and there would be a nickname in the same way as Margaret Thatcher and the Milk Snatcher, and I just can't see it happening. But rightly, people go, governments are making difficult decisions, and is something going to get caught in the crosshairs? Again, we don't have that sort of political crystal ball to know all the answers. but you'd be a very, very unpopular person to change or get rid of the state pension.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think we've summed up the majority of things that we can talk about with regards to the state pension. What we're going to start exploring over the next few episodes as well is how you can use that in conjunction with other income sources to sort of really try and have a sustainable retirement.
One last bit, if someone watching this says, I know I've got a state pension, but I don't know how I'm going to get. What's the easiest way for them to find that information?
Was that sort of how do you know how much is? Yeah. Okay. So the easiest way, I suppose, there's a couple of different ways, but the easiest way that I find, if you've got the HMRC app, or the government gateway that quite a few people have on the phone, you can log into that somewhere down by national insurance contributions and state pension. You can click in there, and that'll give you a summary of sort of where your current contributions are at. So for mine and Matthew's, they're relatively low because we haven't been paying it for a while. Because we're young. And then it shows you sort of how many contributions you expected to make and what's your expected state pension. And within that area as well, that shows you any gaps that we've spoke about that you might be able to pick up.
And if you don't have a government gateway, don't worry, there is a phone number you can ring, and yes, it will be busy at the minute because people are topping up their state pension and the NI, but we'll put that number in the show notes, and if you give it a ring, give them your national insurance number, go through security, they should be able to tell you how many years you've got, and crucially, if there's any extra years that you can top up to get you to the full state pension as we've described.
Yeah, absolutely. If there's any sort of key takeaway of this episode, I'd say it is to make sure you double checking that plenty of time in advance of April this year, because if you are nearing retirement and maybe not at the full state pension, this might be sort of your last chance to top up any previous years.
Yeah, I thought the key takeaway was your mystery segment and that the Romans had introduced the state pension. And if anyone has got any difficult questions for Joe for future episodes, definitely please put them in the comments, and we'll look forward to going through those in a future episode. In general, state pension is certainly one that people ask questions, so if you do have any questions, certainly put them in the comments and we'll try and answer them as part of another episode. And I think we've probably covered everything, and we can let people move on to the next one.
Yeah, absolutely. As always, new episodes every Tuesday with ourselves, and we'll see you next time.
And please like and subscribe.
Thank you.